Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, of course, Cyrus, very much for having put together all of this. It's been really a great morning, and and I'm sure it will be a very nice continuation of the conversation. So, myself and Massimiliano wrote together the chapter on the two German states in the Middle East in the Cold War, and the idea that we have for this presentation, of course, is not going to be that of going into detail. We will not be talking to you about each and every event that took place in the course of those 4 decades. But rather, the idea is to really try and use the 15 minutes that we have, and I'm going to try and be good with the time management, to do 3 main things. So first, we want to give you a sense of what the chapter is about for those of you who read it and for those of you who maybe did not have a chance to read it yet. We would also, however, like to use this opportunity to brainstorm together about some key points, but also open questions that we have after the writing of this first draft. And then, of course, on the basis of this brainstorming and possible comments, questions, lay the grounds for the restructuring, rewriting of the chapter as necessary. In order to do these 3 things, as I mentioned, we will not follow a very thorough, let's say, overview, but what we wanted to do was also to respond to 3 main questions that we received from Cyrus just after we wrote the abstract. So 3 questions that helped us write the chapter, but that we also wanted to get back to in this moment of presenting the draft. I think another very important point to mention before I read out the 3 questions and the 3 points is the fact that in any case, of course, the presentation will proceed in chronological order, and what we decided to do was that I will be discussing and presenting the 1950s and 60s, and Massimiliano will take over and talk about the 1970s and 80s. This is not just about, it's nice to have 2 decades per person, although, of course, that's part of it as well, but it's related to, I think, a more important point, which has to do with matters of chronology and periodization, namely that for our case, so that of the 2 German states, there are some very specific dynamics that are related to the German Cold War that render the 1950s and 60s very different from the 1970s and 80s. So I just wanted to put it out there. In terms of the 3 broader questions to help us navigate these 4 decades in 15 minutes and 2 presenters, the first point was a question to reflect about the so-called push and pull factors. So to what extent or what was the balance between the German actors pushing into the Middle East and North Africa versus being pulled in, and whether this is a helpful question at all to think about when writing these kind of chapters, for example. The second question is that of what I put there as margins for maneuver, using the title of a book that was credited by 2 colleagues of mine. But really the question is, what were the points of overlap with and differences from the respective superpowers, which is quite relevant for the 2 German states. And then the question of a comparative note. So how was the Middle East similar to, but also different from, other regions in the Cold War for the 2 German states? So we will try and address these points now as we go along. But before I really start, I wanted to show you a map that I think is quite telling, at least for me, about how the Middle East played out in the rivalry between the 2 German states. This is a map that was prepared by the East German Foreign Intelligence Services towards the end of the 1960s, and it's a map about the military strategic relevance of the Middle East. And what I find quite interesting is that really 3/4 of this image is occupied by the division between East and West, and there is not a lot of the Middle East physically on this map. In a way, this, I think, it can be a nice illustration of something that we saw quite a lot in the writing of our previous work and this chapter as well, which is how much this bipolar rivalry, but specifically also this German declination of the bipolar rivalry, how much that shaped their views of the region and also their engagement with various countries in the region during the Cold War decades. So this is just as a point to start. Of course, the two German states were created artificially in the wake of the Second World War, and they were pitted in a competition against one another, which was not of their own choosing, not of their own making, but once they were placed within it, they each tried to make use of it in order to advance their own political ends, which were essentially that of being seen as legitimate, prestigious actors in international affairs. And in terms of this balance between push and pull factors, I would just want to mention an episode briefly, which is that it's something that I think is quite telling about this overlap between German Cold War and Middle Eastern dynamics. Namely, the story really starts for us in the early 1950s with the West German decision to sign a reparations agreement, a Wiedergutmachung or Shilumim, with the representatives of the State of Israel and the Claims Conference. This agreement had to do, of course, with the aftermath of the Holocaust, but because of when this took place, so 1952, inevitably it also came to overlap with dynamics that were related, in this case, with the conflict, with the Arab-Israeli conflict, Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Why am I mentioning this? Because, and this is just an example, and I will not read very much into it, but it's important to say that the agreement, the negotiation, signing, ratification thereof was very much contested on the part of the League of Arab States, but also here you have an example from from Syria in particular, but it was a broader coalition than just one state that challenged the idea of this reparations agreement, posing also the question of what should happen with the refugees, the Palestinian refugees from the 48-49 war. This overlap, let's say, of dynamics and conflicts was something that West Germany, in this case, very much tried to avoid, but in the end was impossible to avoid. Please read the chapter if you want this story in more detail, because I will just very quickly mention that on the back of this signature of the agreement, of the protests that accompanied and followed it, this is how East Germany, the German Democratic Republic, managed to score its first, let's say, important victory in the Middle East, which was a relatively modest, actually, agreement with Egypt, signed in 1953. What happened then was that West Germany was present, was trying to assuage some of the Arab partners about the consequences of the agreement with Israel, but an East German delegation showed up. And this might not seem shocking if you don't know that this was absolutely anathema to West Germans at that time, because they were operating on the principles that West Germany was the sole representative for the whole of Germany, in a way to delegitimize the existence also of the German Democratic Republic. This is something that in 52-53 was not yet codified as the Hallstein Doctrine, which later it became in 1955, so which essentially said that any recognition of the GDR was going to be interpreted as an unfriendly act by West Germany. But it was important because it essentially highlighted how much also Middle Eastern actors, in that case was Egypt, were also able and willing to play out this East-West rivalry also for their own ends and for their own purposes. So this was, let's say, in terms of these push and pull factors, an example that we thought could illustrate the dilemmas that we faced and that we tried to write about when preparing the chapter. Of course, at the same time, this is also related to the other question. So how was the Middle East similar to, but also different from other regions? Because you have to imagine that this German competition was a competition that was about trade, but also political prestige, new markets. In many ways, it had a global reach, it had global effects. But of course, in the Middle East, there was something which was very, very different compared to these other regions in which the two Germanys competed with each other, which was really the presence of the State of Israel in the region, which meant implicitly that there, in this region, like nowhere else in the world, the two German states, or representatives of the two German states, were confronted by issues that had to do not only with their Cold War rivalry, but also with the legacy of the Nazi past and how they decided to interpret it or mention it or act upon it or not in the international domain. Just one final point before I move on and I pass the word to Massimiliano. The question of which kind of margins for maneuver did each German state have in this antagonism and rivalry in the region. The broader conclusion that we have for this initial part, which is very much characterized by the Hallstein Doctrine, is that largely, of course, actually there was a lot of overlap between superpower strategies and interests and that of the respective German ally, but that we also saw some elements of perhaps independence is too strong a word, but of friction between each German state and the superpower. Often this also meant a closer cooperation with some other of the junior partners in each bloc, rather than directly with Washington or Moscow. Now, what is also important to mention is that there was, let's say, this Hallstein Doctrine, also this overlap between German and Arab-Israeli dynamics also meant that for many years, there was a sort of diplomatic standoff, in the sense that West Germany tried to avoid establishing diplomatic links with Israel, so exchanging official diplomatic relations with Israel, for fear that the Arab countries would retaliate by recognizing East Germany. All of this explodes in 1965, and you can see here, this is an image of when Ulbricht was invited to Cairo. You see him here with Nasser, which was a fantastic publicity win for the German Democratic Republic, and it also gradually pointed to this end of the Hallstein Doctrine, which was abandoned in 1969, and then, of course, in the early 1970s, the situation is different. And here I will leave the word to Massimiliano, who can speak about this and wrap up for me as well. Thank
you. Yes. Now we shift to the grim and sober style of, not of the story, but of presentation for sure, and dealing with the other chronological period of the 70s and the 80s. And now, as you see from the word presentation, anyway, there are three main elements that feature the German state's engagement in the Middle East. First, some kind of a complex of this juxtaposition of the Arab-Israeli conflict and the German Cold War, with all the legacies of the Nazi past, of course, and let's say after the Grundlagenvertrag of '72, that is the mutual political recognition, not diplomatic but political. Let's say, as a matter of fact, the rivalry between the two Germanys somehow diminished. They continued, never being in the same economic consortium, rivaling over the cultural representation of German philosophy and thinking, and so on and so forth, supporting different allies as for the Arab-Israeli conflict, and so on and so forth. But as a matter of fact, once they were all recognized, they had all their emphasis there, somehow it was a kind of normalized competition that re-entered back into the normalcy of Cold War competition somehow. On the other side, another factor that came into prominence was the concerns over the balance of payments. We were in the years of the oil shocks or oil booms, depending on the perspective. For sure, for the Germans, were oil shocks. And here came into prominence an element that was there already before, but now became urgent: the need for markets in order to offset the deficits due to oil imports, because both states were consuming more and more oil. They wanted more and more oil, okay, and somehow they had to pay for even Middle Eastern consumptions, and they have to find markets. Western Germany did succeed. Eastern Germany, not that much. Not that much. Not that much. And then the other element for their engagement in the region was what I call as proximity to their respective European projects. Because as a matter of fact, the Middle East is not Middle East. The Middle East is a Near East for continental Europe, to say the least. It's a Nahost. Vicino Oriente, Proche Orient. So that, which means that you doesn't choose your neighbor, you must deal with them, and the Near East is just too proxy, and you must care about this. So how to relate, how to engage, and here the two add their own perspective, and they place the relevance of the Near East within their own understanding and participation to European projects. The failed one of Khmer and the more successful one of the European communities. And here West Germany learned to fit its own peculiar privileged relations with Israel within the European framework, and still participating. Then autonomy or independence in the 70s and the 80s. I would call it a qualified dependence. Because from, as for the Arab-Israeli conflict, of course, the more the Arab-Israeli conflict was entering the Western orbit in terms of a solution, the better was for West Germany. And the contrary was for the GDR. The same was as for the balance of payments, but here with medium dependence on the US, because the US as well as the UK had a different approach to the oil shocks and even to the responses, even to the recycling of the so-called petrodollars. The West Germans said, okay, we pay that money by selling. Whereas the other, we dealt with the issue with finance. Two very different consequences. That's it. And then the proximity, very low dependence. West Germany framed everything within the European context, even a kind of, I think it's a kind of defensive posture that worked pretty much. And whereas the GDR actually, okay, and it is here a note of comparison with the Soviet Union. They relied on the Soviet Union, but at the same time they were different in the sense that political considerations and in the close relation with Arab Marxists played the upper end over any other concerns. Then their own kind of Marxism, according to which Assad was more Marxist than the Syrian Marxist. Anyway, that was. And then to end, since of course we're late, comparative notes. Okay, I think that the reason we are here is speaking about Germany and not about France or Italy, why not, is just the fact for two main reasons. One, there were two German states that many people liked around the world. Second, like Assad or our Andreotti. Second, and that, let's say, subsided during the 70s and the 80s to a certain, so the core was the 50s and the 60s. And then was the overlapping between the Arab-Israeli conflict and the Nazi past. And that remained. That remained of paramount importance even in the 70s and even in the 80s, even though they found out ways, in particular West Germany, to handle it and to frame it within a more broader, let's say, network that is the European one. So that's it, the conclusion. Both German states framed their foreign policy in German Cold War as a contribution to the global Cold War in the Middle East, and they followed the ups and downs of the two camps within the Middle East. But here, so that this case, this specific case, might relate even to the relevance at the end of the day of the Cold War. And here we must qualify what was, as a matter of fact, the Cold War, not only top-down, and that's for sure importance, of paramount importance, ultimate importance, but even bottom-up. Otherwise, where Cold War is just another stage of imperial or imperialist take on the region. And it maybe will be the case. I'm arguing in favor, but with some qualifications. And here I think that the question of the balance of payments and the legacies might play quite an important role, because then it related to the kind of political orders and societies each ally, each camp wished to build or actually allied to in the region. Because different political orders meant different markets, meant different sectors. And here, I think the timeline, the chronology might, between defense and, let's say, development, might be something different. So we still have a way to qualify. Thank you very much. We're late.
Let me just take a moment to thank Syracuse for organizing, and not just the conference, but the volume and the logistics, as well as to everyone else assisting. Thank you all to my fellow panelists, and thank you all. I know after lunch, this is a tough slot for us to be in. So I'll do my best to keep you awake and keep myself awake. The central focus of my chapter is on U.S. Cold War policy in the Middle East. And the argument I make in the paper is that the Cold War was an American project. And here I'm drawing on several scholars as well as my own previous writing. So far from a contest of equals, the United States dominated the Soviet Union in the Middle East and North Africa. The region called the Middle East was and remains a site for the exercise of American hegemony. And Washington's Cold War policies, I contend, reflected and reified an American security imaginary that was driven by a strategy of post-war global primacy. So during and after World War II, especially in the immediate aftermath, the United States was committed to primacy and ensuring that the post-war order that it constructed reflected America's predominant position, militarily, politically, economically, and culturally, as I'll talk a bit about. And it's demonstrated in part by these quotes. Some of these should be familiar to you if they're not. So you have, for example, John McCloy, and you'll notice this is all through January 45 while the war is going on, until a month or two after it's over, with President Truman telling Congress, we must relentlessly preserve our superiority on land and sea and in the air. You have Secretary of the Navy and then later Secretary of Defense James Forrestal. The United States will respond wherever aggression arises in the world. How is this to be achieved? Well, quite simply, at the end of World War II, the United States had 2,000 bases around the world. The Soviet Union never came close. you will notice that those bases effectively encircle the Soviet Union, and they were matched by air bases and transit rights, in which the Middle East played a key central role. Now, that's 45. Here's 89. So there's a fewer number of bases, about 1,600, but they're much larger. And you'll also notice that there's an even greater number in and around the Persian Gulf and Middle East. So, as I discussed in the chapter, these quotes represented policies that were established in the early post-war period. Now, the base issue is just one actual component of what the United States is trying to achieve. Because even though the Soviet Union had a larger number of conventional forces, and you would constantly hear about the Soviet Union's advantage in conventional forces, U.S. military planners knew that they lacked the logistics means to support any kind of invasion of either the Middle East or Western Europe. And as I mentioned, Moscow did not have anything comparable to what the United States had created. And by the end of the Cold War, that, as I mentioned, those number of bases were greater. Now, in arguing that the Cold War was an American project, here I'm drawing on the work of Andrew Stevenson, and I'm extending it to the Middle East. Stevenson focused, for example, on George Kennan's claims of American exceptionalism and utopianism as seen in the Long Telegram and in the sources of Soviet conduct. So here are a couple of brief quotes here that you can see. And one of the things I want to focus on, which Stevenson doesn't, is the colonial territories. All right. So here, what Stevenson is going to focus on, for example, is the kind of the broader Cold War strategy that Kennan is promoting, and how it reflected this American utopianism, but also Kennan's misunderstanding of communism, Soviet intentions. What I'm arguing is that Kennan also misjudged Soviet intentions in the colonial territories, particularly in the Middle East. Right? And indeed, Stalin, as we now know, and the Soviet leadership were not focused on the colonial territories. Even by the 1960s, so we're now looking at almost 2 decades into the Cold War, when that shifted, the United States still maintained the predominant position in the region, and would for another decade, including for maybe just a brief period, I would argue, that there was a Cold War contest in the Middle East, roughly after the Six-Day War in 1967, but then really by 1978, it's over. The Cold War in the Middle East is done. I'll talk more about that in a moment. Now, what's the key factor here? One key factor is that the British and French, as I'm sure we'll hear about in a bit, were eager to play on American fears of communism, right? And part of that was to exaggerate Soviet influence within their imperial holdings, and thereby ensure that the Americans would maintain those possessions, or help them in maintaining those possessions. As many of you no doubt know, to take this outside of the Middle East, for example, the United States funded the French war in Southeast Asia to the tune of 80%, right? Now, this was further reproduced in NSC 68 and its discussions of aggressive containment and rollback that had intended and unintended consequences across the Third World, including the Middle East. So Kennan's claims, as well as those of Nitz and Acheson in NSC 68, were not an accurate assessment of Soviet intentions or their actions or even their capabilities. NSC 68 is, in fact, really much more telling about what the United States is capable of than the Soviet Union. But what they were was articulations of American priorities and perceptions in areas that they believed to be essential to maintaining primacy. So, the Middle East geographic position and its resources were key to American primacy. This was explicit in the Truman Doctrine and its overt and covert implementations. And I think that's important. There was an overt aspect to the Truman Doctrine and a covert aspect to the Truman Doctrine, part of which was funded by the Marshall Plan. But here, Middle East oil plays an essential role, right? It's the single largest expenditure in the Marshall Plan. And then there's also a carve-out from the Marshall Plan to fund covert operations, not just in the Truman Doctrine areas, but globally. The Soviet Union has nothing comparable at that time, certainly not in the Middle East. And you could argue across much of what was then, what we later termed the Third World and then the Global South, It's the United States that's engaging in covert operations. It's the United States that's overthrowing governments left and right. It's not the Soviet Union. So, militarily, the Middle East was key to Allied war planning. It was also key, for example, if you've ever studied Anglo-American war planning, it allows the British to feel, important, and in fact, to feel like equals with the Americans, and they have all the outrageous plans for the bombing and turning the Middle East into kind of this atomic and nuclear wasteland. It's quite profound and frightening reading, and then ultimately abandoned by the missile age. And of course, with apologies to Mark Trachtenberg, this is taken from him, and you can see that the United States versus the Soviet Union, in terms of nuclear stockpiles, it's not even close. Now, of course, it only takes about 50 of these to end all life, but that didn't stop us by 60 and 63 to getting where we are. Now, many of you are probably saying, okay, but what about the missile age? Well, as many of you should know, right, by the time we get to the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy is informed that we know you campaigned on a missile gap. Actually, it was before the missile crisis. It was about a month after coming into office. We know you campaigned on a missile gap. There is a missile gap. It's ours. 4-1. And it'll be higher in a few years. Here's the other thing the United States had. Strategic bombers and the ability to deliver those weapons that the Soviet Union never, ever had, and Russia doesn't have today. All right. So what Cold War? And who was running it? Now, I want to add that related to this, let me come back a little bit. Okay. So, related to this, but also independent, were American experts from key firms that helped to develop the infrastructure of the Persian Gulf states. All right. So one of the things I'm going to tease out in the chapter is, of course, the role of American educational institutes, particularly the American University of Beirut, the American University in Cairo. Keep in mind, those are founded by American missionaries in the late 19th, early 20th century, and they serve to train political and lesser so military, but political and business elites in and around the region. The Soviet Union has nothing comparable. Certainly not to the influence of AUB, and much later by the 70s, AUC, 70s and 80s. Now, that doesn't mean they bring students to the Soviet Union, but the United States does that as well, as I talk about in the chapter, all right? But the Soviet Union had nothing like AUB and AUC. Now, in addition to the linking of oil to the US dollar, the role of experts in the region was an important recycling of petrodollars and the rise of companies like, for example, Bechtel, which builds effectively the Persian Gulf. Right? So that recycling of dollars and then the decision or the linking of it to both the US dollar but then US expertise is really important as a soft power bleeding into hard power component of US primacy. Now, the other thing this does is also leads to America's domination of the peace process, as we heard a little about this morning. And excluding Moscow, it also facilitated Egypt's shift into the U.S. sphere of influence, but also Syria's intervention in the 1970s and then eventual occupation of Lebanon, all of which can be tied back to U.S. domination of the peace process. Now, American predominance in the MENA was pronounced through the first 3 decades of the Cold War. Yet policymakers and strategists perceived and often exaggerated Soviet influence during these decades. I argue that the security imaginary was intended for domestic consumption, something we don't talk about enough when we think about the Cold War. And that it was to maintain domestic support for a region policymakers deemed vital and strategic. Now, tied into this were many of the Orientalist notions that get embedded in press coverage, but also the statements of policymakers, both public and in secret documents. And of course, it was reproduced in the presidential doctrines and their varying boundaries, from Truman and Eisenhower to Carter. But it was also demonstrated by the appellations introduced by Kissinger and Brzezinski that did not represent a reality on the ground, but their own perceptions and fears of what could occur and the domestic implications. So for Kissinger, the Lebanese Civil War and the implications for the Arab-Israeli peace process, the disengagement agreements he's negotiated, the potential for another Arab oil embargo in the middle of the 1976 election. And he's quite open about this in talking to regional ambassadors. For Brzezinski, the invention of the arc of crisis, and reproduced wonderfully by Time magazine, all of which Brzezinski will tell Carter is really about re-election. Now keep in mind, Americans are really bad at geography, okay? Most Americans, if I can just do a quick aside, Syracuse, if you don't mind. I was contacted by a reporter to look at some polling for a company called Morning Consult. So what's great about Morning Consult, at least when they used to do it, was they actually have the participants take a test, a geographic test, to see if they could identify, in this case about Ukraine, where is Ukraine, where is Russia, and where is the United States? Now, I say this as a university professor, that I'm sad to report these were 2,000 registered voters in the United States on Inauguration Day. I'll bring that up. 19% of those that were polled could not identify the United States on a map. 19, 1-9. 79% could not identify Ukraine, 59% could not identify Russia. But there's another scary component, which is that of that 19%, when it was cross-tabbed, were the ones advocating for the harshest response on Ukraine a month into the war. Okay, so, but Brzezinski believed that what was happening in Angola or in Somalia or in Iran was somehow going to translate to the ballot box. Now, Reagan is going to make that argument for him, or rather Reagan's advisors in a campaign ad. But I bring this point home that this is about domestic politics and the perception of domestic politics and the perception of America's weakened state. Now, of course, American primacy was challenged. This is not to argue that this was one strong line, that there was no opposition to it. But one of the points I want to make is that this was often an unforced error on the part of the United States. There were intended and unintended consequences. The reimposition of colonial rule had consequences, the support of it. But the United States also attempted in the Middle East, as it did, for example, in Southeast Asia and across what we call the Third World, to adopt third way nationalists is one way to think about it. Nasser was supposed to be a third way nationalist. In other words, military leaders preferred, who were not beholden to Britain or France, and were, of course, anti-communist. So they're constantly searching for these third-way nationalists. In the case of Nasser, it doesn't work out. But the United States, of course, misjudges Pan-Arabism, and it links it, in the Eisenhower Doctrine, for example, to international communism. Now, as we've talked about already, there's also the role of political Islam. So, and I want to throw this caveat out. One of the things I teased out a little bit in the chapter, and I think more work on this is needed, but much of it remains in the shadows, is, of course, America's relationship with the Muslim Brotherhood. So we talk a lot about Iran and political Islam, and we're ignoring the Muslim Brotherhood. And from what we can tell, that the United States may have been cultivating, we know the Saudis were, in the 50s and 60s, the Muslim Brotherhood to counter Nasser. And then we know they reemerge in the 70s in Egypt, and migrate to Afghanistan and Pakistan to join the Mujahideen. Not enough of that story is told, and more of it needs to be, because what's going to happen at the end of the Cold War, as I talk about and touch in the chapter, is that what become known as the Afghan Arabs end up going to almost every single post-Cold War battleground, and in some cases with American support or in opposition to them. And that story is still playing out. So, as it did in its antagonistic relationship with Nasser, which was also this was also transferred to national liberation movements. So that the whole misjudging of decolonization movements as being orchestrated by Moscow is this constant thread you hear. Kissinger will publicly say things, for example, about the PLO that is being directed by Moscow, and privately say something very different. All right, and it won't just be the PLO, but there'll be other movements. And again, the United States saw or perceived or pretended that there was communism or communist influence in virtually every movement. And again, we saw this with the embrace of political Islam in different forms as a bulwark against communism and secular movements up until it challenged American interests. So, I'll wrap it up here. Even as the Cold War is coming to an end, Mikhail Gorbachev is in the middle of his reforms. The top one, for those of you who may not know it, is when Gorbachev was coming to the United States to sign the Intermediate Ballistic Missile Treaty. Now, for those of you who don't study the Soviet side, and I'm not a Soviet expert, but one of the things Gorbachev also gives is not just the IRBMs, but he gives away the short-range missiles for free. He's that desperate for a deal with the United States. And this is how the deputy director of the CIA describes this, and he's joined by the New York Times, which is to say that you can't trust Gorbachev. I know we want to trust Gorbachev, right? But there are clearly great changes underway inside the Soviet Union and Soviet diplomacy, yet it's hard to detect fundamental changes currently or in prospect in the way the Soviets govern at home. So ignoring everything that's happening. And Gates, this is a very long memo. And what's remarkable about it is how many times secret is tagged in the memo. What's also remarkable is how wrong he is in virtually every single aspect of identifying Gorbachev's policies, particularly in foreign policy in the Third World. Completely, utterly wrong. And a year later, the monograph, you can't see it here, but I use it to open up the chapter. Archie Roosevelt, from the famed Roosevelt family, who was active with Kim Roosevelt across the Middle East stirring up trouble, is going to talk about Soviet imperialism in 1988 as a threat to our very civilization, of which the United States are the heirs. And this is as Gorbachev, who's gotten so frustrated with the Reagan administration, is out launching his New World Order tour and is withdrawing from the Third World and withdrawing from Afghanistan, and still a perpetual threat. So when we think about primacy, because if I'm wrong, and I'm happy to be criticized on this, but if I'm wrong, Cold War's over because everything was about the Cold War, right? U.S. should have wrapped up its bases. It would have stopped supporting monarchs and autocratic secular rulers. It would have pushed for democracy everywhere. But that's not what it did, right? 1992 Draft Defense Plan and Guidance. These are not my words, right? This is Khalil, endorsed by Dick Cheney, who said it was brilliant. Our strategy must now refocus on precluding the emergence of any potential future global competitor. Our overall goal is to remain the predominant outside power in the Middle East and preserve U.S. and Western access to the region's oil. So if it's not about primacy, and if it's not about securing, then why is U.S. expanding bases throughout the 1990s, pre-9/11, and then after 9/11 even further? The United States becomes the largest arms dealer in the world, whereas it had previously been contested with the Soviet Union. And that recycling of petrodollars is not just about bases or weapons, but about Gulf money coming in, funding startups, U.S. real estate, T-bonds, etc. So I'll leave it there, but I look forward to your questions, and thanks for your attention.
Well, hello, folks. I think it's us now. My name is Martin Thomas, and with me is my colleague Mathilde von Bulow. We're going to talk a little bit about France and Britain as colonialists and imperial powers across the MENA. We're not going to give you a PowerPoint presentation, but we're going to talk to some of the points that have come up in our paper and that are still to be debated and worked out. Prior to doing that, may I just say a very quick, heartfelt thank you to Cyrus, to the Fondation Pierre du Bois, to all of you for being here. This is really reminding me what academic life should be about, so thank you. I'm going to talk briefly first, and then I'll hand over to Mathilde. And the first point I would like to make, going back really to our introduction this morning, is I suppose the issue at the heart of what we're trying to do, I think, is to connect the global Cold War with MENA, both in terms of macro-historical processes and micro-historical processes. So our paper necessarily tries to come at that issue from those top-down, bottom-up, if you like, broad perspectives. The first problem we've got, of course, is that conceptually, I think we're united in arguing that MENA is, in many respects, a terribly artificial construct. Now, obviously, there's an enormous amount of work on the idea of empire and the Arab world in the cultural imagination of imperialists from Europe. I suppose the underlying question that informs our paper is how far the idea of MENA actually reconfigures decolonization. And to flip that completely around, how far decolonization changes the MENA. At a very superficial level, it's quite easy to make an argument that by the late 1940s, France is effectively a imperial power. It's a North Africa-focused imperialist. It's also engaged in arguably the last great and perhaps the most divisive settler colonial project of them all in Algeria. Whereas Britain is, and has been for some time, principally a Mashriq, principally a Western Asian imperial power, and is engaged not in settler colonialism, but is engaged in part in trying to reconfigure its relationships, which, to be sure, have a colonial dimension with various Western Asian states and communities, but at another level is actually working out or trying to find ways to operate in the shadow of, or perhaps in partnership with, the United States. So another point you were making this morning, Cyrus, about the sort of long-term impact of US imperialism, US interventionism across the Arab world broadly configured, is something I think that engages France and particularly Britain very differently. Moving on from that, it's really, I think, quite easy to argue, and I hope our chapter hasn't taken the easy route. I think it perhaps hasn't, but it's quite easy to argue that the history of Franco-British imperialism across the Arab world is fundamentally running, in one sense, is on parallel lines. Both are irredeemably colonialist, both are pursuing imperial advantage, really until very late in the day, and arguably authentic decolonization still hasn't happened across much of this region we're dealing with, which is something we can also discuss if we like. But in another sense, they're not running on parallel tracks at all. And of course, those dissonances, those misunderstandings, and I would call them cognitive dissonances between the British and the French as imperial states and as imperialist societies, are absolutely fundamental to what we discuss in the paper. To be a little bit more sort of practical in explaining that, for instance, there is very much a strong domestic blowback, particularly in France, to MENA decolonization, particularly, of course, to North African decolonization. It reconfigures France as a society. It throws up questions about the nature of societal racism and the nature of difference in France that I don't think are happening in the same way in Britain because of MENA-related issues. Britain is facing similar questions, but they are principally in relation to South Asian communities, Caribbean communities, etc., etc. The parallel tracks, though, are there insofar as, although one is dealing, for instance, with very different immigrant communities in both countries, the experiences of discrimination in housing, in healthcare, in education, across the board, are ultimately fundamentally similar. So you can construct an argument, if you like, that there is essentially no Franco-British difference. You can construct an argument, if you prefer, that there is actually fundamental Franco-British difference, and that's something we wrestle with quite consistently. I think that dilemma of difference versus continuity, difference versus similarity, if you like, is there as well once one strays into the realm of political economy, and particularly international political economy. Our co-panelists have all talked about that in various guises. But again, at one level, the parallel track seems obvious. We're talking about a fundamentally extractive imperialist project in both countries' cases. At another level, though, they are utterly different. France embarked on what is, broadly speaking, something integrationist, something that posits a closer long-term economic union and a fundamentally protectionist economic connection between itself and territories, particularly in North Africa, but to a degree in the Middle East more broadly. Britain, on the other hand, perhaps kidding itself, but substantially arguing that it is engaged on something that is founded on free trade, that naturally, therefore, meshes much more easily with dollar free trade, Bretton Woods, post-Bretton Woods, neoliberal kind of interventions, etc. We heard talk just now about petrodollars. Well, of course, Britain's adjustment to a euro-dollar market in the late 50s and the sort of differing political economy of finance across the MENA leaves the British in one place, the French very much, I think, in a world of a sort of, as Mathilde was discussing with me over lunchtime, of a sort of a domaine réservé, still thinking in terms of areas that have to be protected and shut off from a wider world. And then finally, the last sort of parallel track or non-parallel track that I would raise at this early point is about sort of long-term reversals. Britain, in a way, gets its major reversals out of the way early in the Cold War. It's kicked out of India. It leaves Palestine very unwillingly in a lot of ways. Its early traumas of decolonization are there at the Cold War's inception. For France, the experience is very, very different. Its major decolonization traumas are substantially later. They are reflected very much differently in terms of the failure of this settler colonial project in Algeria. So there's a very different timeline there. On the other hand, both have made the same fundamental mistake. Both have bet on the idea that comprador elites can be trusted over long term to remain in power, which of course they're desperate to do, but which they do not. And once both the me and the Na, if you like, the Middle East and North Africa, take a more radical, whether you want to call it a new leftist turn, but once we enter the kind of global 60s and into the 70s and beyond, France and Britain, I'd suggest, are left equally adrift by the consequences of their earlier failures, the bad bets they have made as imperialists. So I'll leave it at that point and pass over to Mathilde and maybe come back.
Okay, thank you. Right, so that kind of sets the scene, if you will, and I think we still have some major thinking about how we pack that all into an 8,000-word chapter. But I think they're important themes to bring in. But that's kind of the top-down approach, that we started off with and that we end up with. But in between there, in the chapters, you'll read, we also focus on the bottom-up approach, and I think that's obviously essential when you're dealing with decolonization. You need to look at where that comes from, where that is rooted in. And we skip over a lot of that because obviously this starts well before the Cold War kicks off, obviously, as we all know. And they're interesting things that we could talk about, but haven't talked about the influence both of, I suppose, American ideas, that Wilsonian moment, if you will, self-determination on the one hand, versus the influence of more Soviet ideas, the Bolshevik Revolution, the Comintern, and all of that, and how that feeds into nationalist movements. We skip over most of that. We really start the story, if you will, with the end of World War II. But this is a period, I suppose, we see through the 30s into the Second World War, lots of economic and political challenges. And of course, that produces much more of sort of a populist pressures, I think, for change, which the British and the French respond to slightly differently, although both of them, I think, at the end of World War II are agreed, we want to stay where we are. We don't necessarily want to leave these places. But it feeds and it shapes nationalist movements in different ways and creates, increased pressures for decolonization. And we borrow from you, Cyrus, and your work in a way in terms of looking at sort of the development of, I'm sorry, I'm going to mangle the words, I'm not an Arabic speaker, Watani nationalisms on the one hand and the Qawmiya nationalism on the other hand, and how those relate to one another, feed into one another, play with one another, if you will. In the Middle East, of course, post-World War II, you already, the process of decolonization starts earlier. So the focus in the Middle East in terms of populist pressures, nationalist movements, is much more on economic independence and state building and redefining those relationships with the British predominantly, if you will. Whereas in North Africa, obviously, the pressures are there much more for political independence as well. You see the emergence, of course, of very different movements, some of them much more conservative nationalist movements than other, drawing on those elites, those comprador elites as well. But all of them are increasingly shaped more by populist pressures and have to respond to populist pressures, whether that comes through trade union movements or other types of pressures, which leads to episodes of violence pretty much everywhere, sometimes just short-lived riots, strikes, etc., that are violently put down, sometimes, of course, much more long-term insurgencies as well. And even though you have these different, Watani nationalisms that are created, it's the Qawmiya nationalism, that pan-Arab nationalism, that pulls them all together. And I guess that's where the Cold War comes in for us, right? Because we still have to insert the Cold War somehow here. And the pan-Arab nationalism, it leads to, again, it draws on networks that predate the Cold War, of course, that are long there. A lot of it centers on Cairo as sort of the headquarter of the Arab League. And so there is a diplomatic and a political dimension to all of that. Increasingly with Nasserism, of course, propaganda as well, the role of Radio Cairo as well for propaganda purposes. We talk about all of that. But there is this recognition very early on by nationalist movements, whether that's in Morocco or Algeria or other places, that the way to go to achieve independence is, to internationalize our cause, to work together, right? So transnational connections play an important role here. And the idea is obviously to foster moral and material support. Some of this is engaged at the United Nations, but also other things, other sense. And the Cold War factors in here early on as an opportunity. This is an opportunity to gain support, both from both sides. So positive neutrality is recognized early on as something that can be deployed and can be used to garner that moral and material support that is needed, particularly in the Na region, to achieve political independence. But more importantly, it's about driving wedges between, the Western, especially in the Western alliance, whether that's wedges between Britain and France, or more importantly, between the French or the British and the Americans, and that can be a productive way of gaining support. And that, of course, has an impact on the way nationalist movements, then particularly in the Na, engage in their struggles for independence. It has an impact impact also on the way the French and the British respond. And they do that very differently. You see that after Suez in particular, right? Where the British really realize, okay, well, we need to sort of join with the Americans, and so that becomes more important, that partnership, whereas the French become more distrustful of the Americans, and that has an impact on the way they continue to see their, this domaine réservé. They continue to treat, international relations as such as, we do not want to ally so much with the Americans. There is a third way, and these notions of the third way play an important role there.
Just to wrap things up, the final area that we discuss at length in the chapter is the importance of the MENA as a rights arena. A rights arena in the global Cold War more generally, but a rights arena for Franco-British decolonisation in particular. Now, perhaps that's a very familiar story on the French side in particular, where obviously human rights abuses in Algeria are absolutely front and centre throughout this history. But our argument is, in many ways, that those rights abuses are differently handled by the two imperial powers. Arguably, they're happening as systematically in the British case as in the French. I don't think there's great profit in playing a sort of numbers game and a scale game. It is a systemic issue. The question that we try to engage with is how the two respond, particularly globally and supranationally, to criticisms of not only individual human rights abuses or rights abuses conducted systemically against individuals, but more broadly, the dispossession of communities, the displacement of communities, environmental spoliation affecting communities, slow violence in all its forms. And there, I think the answer we are edging towards, it's perhaps not one we've reached quite yet, is that while both are perhaps equally culpable, the British managed to play a more successful game in their own sort of national interest in supranational fora than the French do. So that is perhaps the final area in which our chapter engages. Thank you very much.
Thank you all so very much. Let me open for Q&A. We have about 40 minutes. Let me maybe suggest that unless a question is very clearly addressed to either of you in this pair, that only one answers a German question or European question. We can maybe go back and forth just so that we have enough time. Okay.
Thank you. That was amazing. And I really agree with you that I do feel like, we're academics. And it feels good. So thank you for organizing this. My question's for Osamah, but I feel like it could apply to other people on this panel. And I am interested, you mentioned the money, the funds that were allocated to the CIA, and mentioned the example of Afghanistan and, of course, the covert operations, the coups. I was wondering if you could speak to maybe the smaller, lesser-known CIA operations in the Middle East. I'm specifically thinking about Turkey and the rise of fascism in the 1970s with the Grey Wolves, and that, of course, then leads to a version of political Islam as well. And Gladio, maybe, right? So there is the connection not just with the rise of Islamism, but also with the re-rise and regrowth of fascism across Europe and West Asia, and how the United States might have played a role in that.
Do you want to collect a bunch of them? Or?
Yeah, maybe. It's maybe a good idea. I see there are lots of hands up, so let me just go sort of by section, okay?
Okay.
Let's maybe do 3 at a time. Does that make sense? 3 questions at a time, and then... Yeah, okay.
Okay, thank you very much. This is a nice panel, and I was amazed how perfectly all these presentations played into each other. So either it was planned by genius, or Cyrus just got lucky. One of those. What I noticed is that you had three very, very different approaches. You have the kind of the return of West Germany, mostly as a Middle Eastern player. You have the demise of France and Britain and the new hegemon, America, and it all belongs together. And what surprised me, no one of you actually mentioned that. But then some years later, both West Germany and the Brits and the French get together in a common foreign European policy vis-à-vis the Arab-Israeli conflict. And would you all agree that perhaps this was also a way of containing the man in the middle, the United States? Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. We try to be concise and clear. About doctrine and doctrines. Truman Doctrine. Yes, Truman Doctrine, it is mainly and basically, yes, everybody under the U.S. protection. But when Truman used to be president in the U.S., but if any president, he is an exercise, nobody can criticize Mr. President, that could be like that or like that. We can see Nasserism doctrine. It was a really political doctrines after he died. But we can say, and it is true, Truman Doctrine went when he passed away. But anyway, Truman Doctrine, it was useful because Roosevelt, isolationism, his vision is under everybody under isolation in the US. This is also the perception of his predecessor. But to be American also, to be pragmatic, there was also a doctrine which was successful. Monroe Doctrine in Western Hemisphere at the beginning with the Cuba crisis and at the beginning in 17th. Monroe Doctrine in the Western Hemisphere don't leave anymore any other opportunity for any other case like Cuba. And it was really, yes, pragmatic, but this is in Western Hemisphere. The topic of our conference this year is MENA. I want to just underline about the French and Britain in the Middle East. Yes, the Middle East and the Nearest East, Vicino, Proche-Orient, and the Extreme East. And when we are in the US, that perception for some Americans, the Middle East started since the Atlantic River until Pakistan. And also in the international organization, division, the multilateralism, but also in banks, because Swiss banks or any banks, they have managing funds coming from regions, then there is some point of view. But the last point what I want to underline, because when French used to be, at the beginning of the Cold War and before the beginning of the Cold War, the French colonialism, mainly in Algeria, because started in Algeria and ended in Algeria, and thanks to Algeria, the other independences process. But what did happen between Britain Navy and the French Navy until nowadays, it is not really well known, mainly in Marcel Kibir. And the son of de Gaulle, he died recently, 2 years ago, 100 years old. He used to be admiral in the French Marine Navy, because in Marcel Kibir there was between Britain Navy, Marines, and which is not really until nowadays not commented in the history. And I leave it here. Stop. Thank you.
Let's take these three.
So I'll just, in response to the question, I think on the covert operations, there's a lot of lesser-known coups in Syria in the 40s into the 50s that are, it's like one operation after the next. There's a constant rotation of Syrian governments, really almost until you get to the 60s. It's almost every few years it happens. There's a lot of speculation about the 70s coups. I always get questions like this from Turkish friends, like, what do you see in the archives about like 70 or an 80? And so there's, let me separate the questions, just say for the 40s and 50s, Hugh Wilford's book, America's Great Game, talks a lot about the coups, and at least in the Levant, that I think is worth reading. There's the ones we know about, there's the ones that, usually they're the ones that either succeed or fail badly. Like those are kind of the Syrian examples. We get other hints, for example, Suez. One of the things that the Americans are telling, Eisenhower and Dulles are telling the British, wait till after the November election, and then we're going to take care, the Americans are going to take care of Nasser. And so one of the questions was, what is Kim Roosevelt doing? What are the Roosevelt boys doing? Are they going to go back into Egypt and have their own little surprise? There's an edited volume on 58, and so one of the points I make in the chapter you can take a look at is, the Americans are constantly, they see Nasser behind every, everything that happens, and then behind him is Moscow, right? And so, there's the question about, was there, a potential, the different coups that pop up around 58, or the nationalist coups versus counter-revolutionary coups. So there's a bunch of different ones. And then, of course, there is a broader, beginning with, most people think it begins with Mossadegh. It doesn't. It's actually probably Syria is where this really begins in the 40s and into the 50s. And then you get Mossadegh and then Arbenz. And then basically the Dulles boys are off to the races. Because throughout the 50s, they're doing a bunch of, whether it's Indonesia, et cetera, trying a bunch of stuff. So I'll turn it over to the others. But let me just, one last thing, and then on the Truman Doctrine. So whether it's Monroe or Truman or Eisenhower or Carter or Bush, this is the very definition of imperialism, right? It's the very definition of imperialism, that I have a doctrine as a country that says the Western Hemisphere is off limits to anyone, all right? That's the definition of imperialism. No one asked the United States to do that. Certainly not. And in fact, one of the things, like in your standard kind of intro to U.S. foreign policy, the U.S. doesn't even enforce it. It's the British who actually enforce it, all right, for the first 2 to 3 decades. The Truman Doctrine doesn't just end when Truman leaves. In fact, one of the problems is that it becomes this template for others. So when Carter does his doctrine, right, it's modeled after the Truman Doctrine. And then what they do is they leak it to a friendly reporter, and it's the New York Times who starts calling it the Carter Doctrine, right? But this is, by definition, an imperial action. It's an imperial edict, right? That's another way you could think about it. You may not agree with that, but quite frankly, that's what it is.
I'll just quickly come back on Roland's point about Western European partners and the Arab-Israeli conflict. I think you're absolutely right, certainly in regard to the British there. They do very strongly mobilize both what they perceive to be more pro-Palestinian positions, particularly in France, but also within the West German state, broadly speaking from the early 70s onwards, to conceal, if you like, their own underlying pro-Palestinian position, but one that they, and I'm talking here about the 2 principal political parties in Britain, feel unable or unwilling to openly admit to. I mean, it's a shameful position, and it persists to this day, I think. But both of the major parties in the UK are so fundamentally split on the Arab-Israeli conflict that it's profoundly debilitating to government, I think. There is not that same split within the bureaucratic community, and it's the bureaucracy that I think uses that Western European partnership in that more constructive manner.
Yes, if I join to the question. Partially, yes. The European initiatives were, on the one hand, an answer to accommodate with, let's say, the collective Arab agency. Basically, because they understood that, at least since the mid and late of the 60s, the balance of power was changing. They could not operate as it was before. And so, yes, those initiatives were part of a kind of, well, for sure, were effort to accommodate, starting with the major initiative. It was the Global Mediterranean Policy of '72 that pointed to a new approach, collective approach of European communities towards the region, with some good results on both sides. if you look at the, let's say or the memories of even from the Arab partners, that was the only even agreements they ever made with Europeans, the cooperation agreements over the 70s, out of oil strength. Stop. Second, they, on the other side, those initiatives were even to, let's say, to contain US approaches that were more confrontational. At least that's what most historiography agrees upon. But then we have to qualify, because there were some nuances. The France and partially were more vocal in saying, okay, these are alternatives, okay, to the US. Whereas others were more nuanced and not by chance. They were the defeated powers, were Germany and Italy. That, as a matter of fact, they agreed with France to a certain extent, but they wanted to integrate in a way, and they couldn't say so loud that these initiatives were even to contain the US, while they all agreed, at least France for sure, was Germany, the more so Italy, on getting Soviet supplies. So accommodate the Arabs, looking at East, and contain the big brother.
Let's keep how we can find it.
Yeah, thank you very much for a really great panel. I think it wasn't difficult to not fall asleep after lunch, so thank you very much for that already. An explicit thank you also to Martin and Mathilde's paper, because it was the first to explicitly mention the NA part of... Is it? Sorry?
Am I audible to you?
Is there? Is it me talking? No. Okay, let's see. I have two voices, actually. So okay, thank you for bringing up the NA part of this story, because I think for the whole first part of the day, we exclusively talked about the me part, so that was good. And the question out of that is to the two other papers. Wouldn't it be worth taking a closer look into what happens in North Africa for you as well? Because do you have hypotheses about that already? My hypothesis would be that it is an important testing ground to check what you said about the me region, because actually, in the North African parts, the influence of European powers is much stronger, stronger than the US maybe, or at least present for a while, and there is this explicit plan brought up after Suez to create a Mediterranean, what you call a Mediterranean moment, a Mediterranean union from the Maghreb countries, together with Spain, together with West Germany as well. So there's more. It is more diverse if you take this picture in. And also, last question to Mathilde and Martin. You mentioned the European integration process was mentioned earlier. Do you have any hypotheses also about how the decolonization networks and the late imperial networks of France and Britain fed into a later European economic policy for that region? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I have
I have some questions for dinner, actually, but for now, just for Mathilde and Martin about the last part of your paper, when you discuss the rise of human rights in this context, we call it human rights zone, and I realize, what you quote there, Derek Moses and others that recently wrote about that. And I wanted to ask you about there's a terminological tension between human rights as a global concept as it emerges after World War II, but especially after May 68, and the language that Arab intellectuals and in the Arab world is using, which is not human rights, which is predicated on liberal rights, on the individualism and so on. The term is not hukuk in Arabic, but karama, dignity. And these speak of two very separate, actually two human rights traditions. I would say a European Northern traditions, liberal one of human rights, and a global South one of dignity. I would say they're not the same. We can perhaps imagine in which ways they're not the same, but I said that specifically these two traditions are going to collide in Palestine. It is there where you see completely, different ways of trying to reach or to settle issues of justice. So I wonder if you can comment if you see this tension, if you agree, if you can elaborate on that in the context again of the Cold War and decolonization. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I really enjoyed this panel as well. I have questions both for Lorena and Massimiliano as well as for Osamah. For the paper on the Germanys in the Middle East, I wanted to ask what importance you would assign to the role of ideas in this encounter, picking up a little bit on what Yoav was saying. Reading the paper, I was struck to see the GDR press after, I think, 67, attacking Israel as a, quote, fascist, Hitlerite state. And I can't help but wonder, does the Cold War or does this German-German competition play a role in kind of transmitting or globalizing the concept of fascism to the Middle East? Clearly, there were resistance efforts against Ataturk, Reza Shah, predating the Cold War, but does the Cold War kind of turbocharge this transfer of ideas? And then likewise, looking further to the 1980s, I wonder about the ways in which debates in German memory culture create a challenging landscape, above all for Palestinian activists. This emphasis on the singularity of the Holocaust, thus kind of foreclosing a dialogue, let's say, with Palestinian activists and Nakba commemoration. Then moving to Osamah's paper, I really enjoyed this. It's always good to have a spirited discussion about kind of the primacy thesis versus, more multipolar approach. A question I have is, or maybe it's just a misunderstanding. I understand the Cold War as being not only about geopolitical competition, but also about ideological tension between capitalism and communism. And if we were to run with the primacy thesis, what room does this leave for actors like, say, the Today Party or the PDPA in Afghanistan or leftists in Lebanon? Were these people deluded in some fundamental sense, or how, if we take a look at left-leaning actors within the region who thought that they were fighting for something or against something, does a focus on this just being about American imperialism dismiss the role of ideology in the region? And then secondly, looking to the 1990s, I would certainly agree that there wasn't a fundamental dismantling of American empire during that period, but it seems like there's maybe room for more nuance here. Hundreds of U.S. military bases were closed domestically. There were significant defense cutbacks, and then foreign bases like in the Philippines were closed. So it seems like part of the story is almost a doubling down on the Middle Eastern empire, while that empire is being stripped away elsewhere, both domestically and in other parts of the globe. So I'm curious if you agree with that and how this kind of perhaps nuance would change aspects of your argument.
If you don't mind, I'll pass on to you afterward. So, right. Thank you for some great questions. Yes, I mean, we agree. North Africa is important and often gets short shrift in these sort of broader histories of the Cold War in the Middle East. So we kind of almost deliberately thought we'd emphasize it a bit more than maybe we should have or ought have. But yeah, it's important. And I agree that the Germanies are important here. I wrote a whole book about it, so of course I would think that. But back to the question you had about European integration and the European integration process and how it intersects with decolonization in the MENA. And I think that's a really important one. And it is very much important. So for instance, it's really only after the Suez crisis that Adenauer, for instance, convinces Mollet and the French that, treaties of Rome, this is the way to go. So it's actually really instrumental in pushing the French into agreeing to that closer union that gets created with the treaties of Rome in 1957. So that's one way in which it's really important. And of course, in a way, the French conceive of that European project as a Euro-African project as well, right from the get-go, right? So not just the French colonies, but also the Belgian and Congo at that particular juncture. They're all included in this project for European integration. I'm not a huge expert on any of that, but it is definitely important. It also explains, I think, French reactions to Britain's attempts to join the EEC, right? And I talked earlier about that dissonance between, or we talked about the dissonance between Britain and France, but also the rivalry between Britain and France, and how after Suez there is this real kind of acrimony, if you will, on the French part towards Britain. And I think it helps explain why de Gaulle just constantly vetoes, Britain's attempts to join the EEC when he does, because he wants to keep it sort of as a French-led club. And that's our domaine réservé, in a way, again, in that kind of thinking. But of course, decolonization influences British thinking about why it's important to maybe join the EEC in the first place as well. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, thank you very much for these three questions. I think just to start in order, the point about expanding, the idea to expand a little bit the chapter or the conversation to include the Na more explicitly, I think is a very valid one. It's partially in the chapter, but perhaps it's something that we can reflect on a little bit more explicitly. The reason why we didn't do it was in the presentation and in the current draft is related to this notion of reflecting on these chronologies and points of uniqueness, let's say, or challenges that render that region different from other ones. But I think it's definitely something important at this stage. So thank you very much for this. In terms of the other two questions, so the turbocharging fascism, let's say, and this kind of narrative discourse, but also ideas in the region as well. I have to say, I'm not entirely sure, because the reason why we included that quote in the chapter was also to make the point that we maybe didn't make so explicitly now about the domestic audiences as well. So that quote was from, indeed, the East German press, mouthpiece of the ruling party. It was very much also for domestic audiences, and this was very, very important. There is a link somehow. The question of East Germany's relations or non-relations with Israel is something that is very important, not just to reach out to the Arab world, but also in terms of domestic messaging too, in this double way that I tried to explain when I was presenting, which is on the one hand outlining a geostrategic positioning of the GDR outside, but it's also always intimately connected to certain decisions about how to frame the legacy of the Nazi past, which is very different in the German Democratic Republic compared to the Federal Republic of Germany. It's more complex even than this nice binary, but this is something that I think it's important to mention. So the turbocharging fascism, I think we can we will check that. But maybe a point that we can make more explicitly is the domestic relevance of these policies. The 1980s and memory activism, the point about the uniqueness of the Holocaust, I think this is really a question for and of our times as well, because the other 2.0 that we're going through is also this Historikerstreit 2.0, where this is, of course, very, very prominent. And I think what we see there, again, maybe something we can reflect on a little bit more, because it's related to how these politics of memory plays out then in these foreign policy stances vis-à-vis the Middle East more broadly, but it's definitely something that is present also a little bit earlier as well, so after 1968, for example, and that's also where this split, and I'm thinking about West Germany in particular, but where the split between broader public opinion and then the political elites becomes quite evident too. So thanks very much also for these comments.
So just real quick answer the two questions. So the chapter actually opens in North Africa with the Atlantic Charter and it being translated and airdropped over North Africa as part of Operation Torch. I don't think I did a great job talking about it here, but it's more detailed in the chapter when I talk about the kings. So we often think about the kings as just being in the petro countries, right? But it includes King Hassan of Morocco, it includes King Hussein of Jordan, or King Idris of Libya, right? So how this network of kings that the United States relies on, right? Particularly before they start looking at secular nationalists, but we're going to rely on these initially and then start looking at, for example, replacing Farouk because he's too allied with Britain and he's seen as kind of ineffectual with a nationalist leader. So depending on where you want to define North Africa, where does it begin and end, right? So, but Morocco's talked about a little bit, Libya, and of course a lot on Egypt in the chapter, and I didn't do a great job here. So hopefully, but the point's well taken. But the key thing there is, again, the air base and air transit routes is why North Africa is important. But even then, Morocco is, for example, more important. You get Morocco, Libya, and then Suez is going to be the main air base right up until really 52, really 56, for the U.S. to project power into the Soviet Union. That's what they're using it for, right? And that's how they see effectively North Africa. When oil is discovered in Libya, it's a little bit different rationale. I talk a little bit about Algeria because of, there's a different approach the United States takes with Algeria than it does, for example, with other movements, even though they have the Algerian example, right? And I mentioned this in the chapter. So yeah, in terms of, I think maybe there's a misunderstanding of my argument on primacy, so I appreciate the chance to clarify it. No, actually, I think this would, this doesn't suggest that those leftist groups were deluded at all, right? It's the opposite, right? This confirms almost every single claim they made, right? Which was that, for example, if you're the LNM or you're the PFLP, you've been arguing you're fighting against imperialism at its root, right? That these local governments are just proxies of, or clients of this great imperial power. The argument here about primacy is the following, that this was somehow, as I mentioned in the beginning, a contest between equals, right? I often get this from students when I teach my global Cold War class. Like, they come in thinking, the Berlin Wall went up in 1945 and that there was nuclear parity and there was atomic parity from the beginning. They have no idea, right? So it's really a challenge about that and thinking about, well, what about all of this planning during World War II? So it's something I've written about before, where, for example, by 43, 44, when the threat, quote unquote, the Nazi threat to the Middle East is over, all of a sudden you have these memos now being produced inside the OSS, right, the precursor to the CIA. We now have to shift to the post-war, right? And so all those intelligence networks start to shift over to preparing for the post-war. And they're not as actually, they won't come out and say this is about the Soviet Union, right, initially, but that's effectively, it almost kicks in almost immediately in 45, 46, right? So this is definitely not this idea that somehow all those leftists were deluded. Look, there's a goal for primacy, right? And there's resistance to primacy, but that doesn't mean that there was parity. Right? The Soviet Union doesn't achieve parity with the United States in terms of nuclear weapons, for example, or nuclear missiles until the late 60s, early 70s, and then we get détente, right? So, and where all of a sudden you start to see that, I'm being, flippant, but Now all of a sudden we're doing salt treaties, right, because there's parity. And at the same time, the situation in the quote-unquote Middle East and North Africa, when we look at how many states were quote-unquote Soviet client states, like if you want to use kind of the language of a Washington policymaker, right? Okay, so Iraq is leaning, right, towards Moscow. Syria is leaning towards Moscow. Egypt is, and then you have you have the Yemens, right? So, but that's it. Right, that's really it. I mean, and then you have the non-state actors that the U.S. is constantly and they're not even focused on them because they just see them. In fact, in the language, like I talked about, like the public language you'll get from someone like Kissinger is, the PLO is just doing what Moscow tells them, right? There's no local agency. There's no agency for these groups. I think what's interesting is for those of us who've studied it and know, kind of some of the discourse internally about the Sino-Soviet conflict, even the discourse on Vietnam. Right, within Washington about what the moves Hanoi's making, how they talk about, for example, the NLF, right? They won't even recognize them. They don't even talk about them. They don't even call them the NLF. It's the VC, right? So part of that, the argument here is if we think about this as a unipolar story, right? That from World War II up until where we are right now in 2020, what year is it? 2025. So right where we are, this is a unipolar story. Right, so one way you could think about it is that the Soviet Union was an aspirant to hegemony, but they never made it. Right, I mean, so doing some IR, some intro IR theory, right? But this is really an American story, the post-World War II American story of unipolarity. Right, so we often think of the unipolar moment as just that brief moment from 1990 till 9/11 or whatever. Right, but if you go further back, and that's I think some of the arguments about primacy is that this is really about arguably 1944 to where we are today. So it's an 80-year story, not a 30-year. You had another question. What was the other question? Was about
1990s as more.
Yes. So this is a really good point. So yes, you have the trauma of the base closings in the U.S., but they're expanding. They're expanding in the Gulf, right? We're not going anywhere, right? And so keep in mind, I've written about. On the one hand, and it's what's the actual policy in the 1990s? Is it, because the way it's going to be justified, you have CENTCOM, right, which is expanding, and the way it's going to be justified is we have a policy of dual containment of Iraq and Iran, but that's not the policy at all. The policy is regime change, right? So they're just not doing it directly. So those bases are expanding, the arms sales are expanding, and of course the recycling of petrodollars back into the U.S. We focus a lot on the point I was trying to make, weapon sales, the bases, but it's much broader than that. And I think that's probably there'll be a point for discussion with the earlier presentation. If oil prices went up, to benefit the Soviet Union, they also benefit the United States. You're not buying oil in rubles, right? This is a massive benefit to the United States. So this is not, I have to say, because your point is quite clear, right? When we think about the ideological contest, right, the reality is the Soviet Union did not compare at all, in spite of every single estimate that the CIA ever produced about Soviet economic capacity was wrong by like tenfold, right? The closest they ever came was probably in 47 when Forrestal, who I mentioned earlier, when his son was in Moscow and is sending him letters back, like literally calls, he's like, this place it's awful, right? Like this is like, right? I think that he has this phrase, it's a remarkable phrase, like the worst possible poverty in the United States is better than being in Moscow in 47. So again, I come back to kind of like, what is the perception that was being portrayed, right? And who is it for? So I think your point about the domestic impact in the 90s is really well taken, right? But that is it's completely separate from what's happening in the Middle East and American plans for the Middle East, as we see from the neocons.
Sorry, Cyrus, could I just very quickly come in on the rights question? Very quickly, because it's a brilliant question and we'll talk about it more fully in a moment. But I'd make three very quick points. One is I totally agree with you that there is a huge we're back to that term, dissonance in understanding of rights, both between, if you like, broadly speaking, those states that are there at the inception of the UN and that construct the parameters of international law, broadly speaking, in the post-war world, and those for whom, particularly within the colonial world, rights are to be disaggregated much more in terms of collectivities than individuals. So that is the first enormous point. The second is that I also agree that in many respects, the insufficiencies of language come out most clearly, particularly in different cultural understandings of rights and what inheres in the individual, what inheres in the group, what makes for, if you like, the moral economy of the person. That is something that decolonizing states and decolonizing communities and societies, I think, understand fundamentally differently. And then lastly, I would say that enormously, yes, it is difficult to construct decolonization in the MENA or the global Cold War in its MENA iteration as a rights struggle. But nonetheless, I would suggest that rights are fundamental to the process, and I'm happy to talk at greater length, but yeah.
Let's do one last quick round, and then...
No, I just thought you needed. In the interest of time, don't feel the need to answer this question, but I was wondering how you all picked your starting points, because it seems to me like all of you could have started much earlier, and there's a lot of conversation of, oh, we need to cut this off. Oh, it's the late empire, not the earlier British and French empire. Oh, the U.S. Cold War began, sometime during World War II, but let's not talk about the 1930s. The German case of political memory, right? How did Deutsche Bank feel when they got cut out of the Turkish Petroleum Company? How does that play into this story? So I was really wondering for all of you why you make the choice to start when you do, and what you think the consequences are. And again, no need to answer this, how you plan to address that in your chapters, right? So a lot of big questions there. I know we're running short on time, so you don't need to answer, but just what I'm thinking about.
Just two quick questions. And I should have said this before, of course, I will, as I think I told you and told everybody, I will write you notes as well, of course. So, question about the Germans here. What about economic actors, German economic actors, particularly in the West German case? How important are they in setting policy or encouraging policy? And this is, of course, part of a much larger conversation, which happens in the US as well. What's the relationship between government interests and this economic interest? And a question for Osamah. It seems to me that as the US post-war empire is in principle, though there are lots of exceptions, is in principle not a territorial one, or not a classical territorial one, right? You have a lot of little bases and extraterritorial rights, but you don't just occupy a whole country, normally, right? As this is the case, couldn't one say that there is a flip side to primacy? And the flip side to primacy, or put it differently, primacy is possible only if you have local elites that are really interested in bringing you in. Put differently, could we say that also in the Middle East, we have what we had, Lundstad said in his famous article in Europe after the Second World War, an empire by invitation, right? And where the rubber really hits the road, to come back to your question, Pierre, before, is those coups. Those coups would not have happened. I mean, Iran 53 is a very good example, I very strongly believe, if local, basically national governmental forces wouldn't have had an interest. So how do we frame this then? Because right now, of course, we only have 15 minutes in presenting, and so obviously you have to front the US part of this. But to what degree should an inherent and integral explanation of the US ability to do this in the first place give a lot of place to those national governments as well?
This is a question for Osamah. So I understand at the core of your argument really is a misunderstanding of American policy. And I mean, there's Pavel Mayuka, right, has this famous line, in 1916 about, is this, stupidity or is this treason, right? And someone could argue, right, is this a mistake or is it intentional? But at the core, right, is a misunderstanding, right, of Soviet intentions or, an incorrect estimation. So I think, we're now, right, at this moment in which the United States is trying to figure out what Chinese intentions are, right? Are we at the birth of a second Cold War? And so we're sort of at this second kind of Kennan moment, right? So if you were to take lessons from the first time around, what did the United States get wrong about estimating Soviet intentions? How could we apply those to do a better job of estimating Chinese intentions today?
On this point of the starting points, so thanks very much. We had a paragraph on this in the sense that we had a draft of the chapter that also mentioned a much earlier history, which we then took out, but we were also discussing we should actually put it in independently, like before today. We had this conversation already because we now start in 45, but what is also interesting and striking is also how the continuities, let's say, from before 1945, these exist in terms of personnel, for example, in the West German diplomatic service, about people who had been there from before and keep being there, but also in terms of interests, networks, knowledge. I think this is also a very relevant, actually, part. So, yeah, starting points matter, and which decisions we take, of course, also do. And I think one of our questions for you, Cyrus, but everyone also, would have been exactly about this. What about the pre and what about the post-Cold War, in fact? And what kind of relationship should our chapters and our works have with this kind of question, which is not just about periodization, but is a broader one? And on the, I will just break the Cyrus law for a second and actually pass the mic to Massimiliano to discuss the economic actors, because this is part of this continuity, perhaps, history too.
Yeah, their role. They were there, of course, as for West Germany, first of all. And yet, since the very beginning, they asked for state guarantees. There was no business without the state. Despite every rhetoric about the free market, no business without the state. And the state in the sense of placing its guarantees through a wide range of instruments, pretty technical, but from a financial point of view, everything was kind of tied business. Not tied aid, but tied business. Since the very beginning in West Germany, and it continued so. As for the industrial sector, which was of paramount and ultimate importance, it was the hallmark. And as for the financial sector, interestingly enough, as for the GDR, because economics was there as well, the GDR, since the mid of the 60s, representative of GDR companies and their trade attaché in the different embassies began claiming for having the autonomy to make profit. But the central authority, and not much the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but the party told them, stay quiet, because politics matter most to us. So and it continued for quite a long time, and arguably till the very end, is that politics matter most than business. So they couldn't make much profit out of this, to the point that they opted to move from clearing or barter standards towards market standards. But they could not. So at the end, they got paying up with the Syrian labor instead of money.
I'll just very briefly mention something about periodization. I mean, I think we mentioned it in our presentation. You know, we're very, very, very aware, obviously, that this history with Britain, France, and the MENA region goes back a long time. So where do you even start in that sense? And we did have long conversations about that. I do think we have to revise that early section and revisit that in light of the kind of conversations we're having here today, and we'll probably have tomorrow as well. I saw your chapter and how far back it goes, and I thought that was actually great. So I agree with your point very much. Something to think about. Where we would start, undecided at this point, but yeah.
I had several different versions of an opening, one which went back to, kind of early American imagination about the Middle East, and then, of course, talking about the Red Scare, Bolshevik Revolution. I scrapped all of that. I tried a different one that began with the long telegram, that whole discussion of Kennan and all that stuff, scrapped that. And then did the typical undergrad thing when it was due for the 13th, and I just, pulled something out and said, here's the intro. So, and I'll come back to it later. So so it's not great. But again, I don't really want to go all the way back to the 19th century because I did that before. And so I just wanted something to focus on kind of the primacy discussion. So it's kind of a cheat, but, but I take the criticism. It's fine. I think there was a China question, then there was what was the other question? Your question. Yes, Syracuse, I'm sorry. So this is something I'm teasing out with a project I'm working on about how do you balance corporate interests and corporate lobbying with policy. I'm trying to think how much I can bring into this because it's not as... it's a little tougher than you would imagine, right? There are these silences in the archives that there shouldn't be, right? How do you show corporate lobbying or any other special interest lobbying, on foreign policy? And it's more challenging than it should be, right? But I'm trying to bring some of those aspects in where I can. But also trying, to tease kind of the project I'm working on. But so I totally take the point. It's more challenging than it should be. All right. You had another question about primacy, about the
local national government.
Yes. So none of this presumes that there's no agency. You're absolutely right. They're absolutely. So I think that's probably maybe the challenge with thinking about. What I'm trying to get across is an American perception, right? So when Leslie Groves, says, you need to think about bases for the next century, right? I mean, right? And that tells us something, right? For those of you who don't know who Leslie Groves is, it's Matt Damon in Oppenheimer, right? And Paul Newman in a worse movie, right? So he has two people who play him, right? So it's important, right? He's a really key, important military planner. And so when they're making that argument, and they're planning this out in 43, 44, 45, right? And keep in mind, there's the general story on the American side about, how does Truman sell the Truman Doctrine, right? And he's told by the Vandenberg on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, you need to scare the hell out of the American people. How else are you going to sell them that our ally, Uncle Joe, is now no longer, our ally? And so, it's a constructed argument, right? And it's based in domestic politics, right? So I think that could be clearer that definitely could be clearer in the chapter. It's not there, and so it'll come in. I just wanted to get you something before, Okay, on China. So I come from a school where they constantly want to go to war with somebody, and China's the new one, right? And I would argue that if you look at, for example, the Atlantic Council. And if you only get their newsletters, and there's one particular person at Atlantic Council who writes a lot of op-eds, and all he does is just replace which country he wants to bomb, every week, right? It's like basically it's like a random rotator, right? And in all seriousness, on the one hand, I used to believe that, and this was an argument I made in something else I've written where, and other people have written, it's not like it's anything original, right? The reality is the United States did not have a lot of trade with the Soviet Union, right? So it's a very different dynamic with China. At the same time, when you look at the actions of the Trump and Biden administrations and now Trump 2.0, right? I think, did you coin that? Somebody coined that this morning. Juicy did. we're headed into a direction, especially with the targeting of technology, where they seem to be, there are individuals within the Washington Beltway who really want this and have wanted it for some time. There's the argument that it's not about containing a rising China, but actually containing a declining China. I'm sure you've heard this, right? You're a China expert. So I would argue that unfortunately, we're headed in this path. I would hope it would be avoided. We're hearing some hints from Trump that it may be avoided, right? That he wants to solve all problems with China. So, but at the same time, what I would argue is you're seeing much like the same kind of panic I talked about Soviet. Think about the recent example with Peru, right? Oh my God, China's giving them money for a port. And so, Secretary of State Blinken runs out and says, we're going to send them 5, dilapidated trains from California, right? I mean, so that panic about the Belt and Road Initiative, the panic about, and if you look at some of the statements that come out of RAND, the reports out of RAND, or any of the different, so that panic about everything China's doing, it's very reminiscent of what I'm describing in the chapter. So does that, I mean, I'm afraid it's unavoidable, but I'm somehow hoping that it will be.
Thank you so much.